This is the Balancing Act by Security Compass, your guide to going fast while staying safe in today's digital world.
Hello, everyone, and welcome today to our podcast of the Balancing Act from Security Compass. Threat modeling is a critical part of securing our software, and it's through threat modeling that we identify potential threats and recommend mitigations to reduce the likelihood of an attack. The challenge we face today essentially is, how do we incorporate threat modeling into some of these modern practices from a developer's perspective? So to address this, joining us today, we have Simone Curzi, who is a principal consultant at Microsoft and author of the open source tool Threats Manager Studio. Simone, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, and nice to meet you, everyone.
Simone, for those that may not know about your background, why don't you tell us a little bit about, how you ended up in the threat modeling space and, some of the things that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. That will be a pleasure. I have been passionate about application security since even before joining Microsoft. And yeah, it has been quite a long story, more than 20 years in the company at this point. And yeah, I've started working on different projects and then I moved to work entirely on application security. Threat modeling is simply the best approach to provide security, to analyze security early. And it's not only something that can be applied to development projects, but we have discovered over the time that it can be applied to any project, including infrastructural ones. Mm-hmm. So that's a great plus for us, for the team.
So let's dive right into this then, Simone. You've been in threat modeling for a long time. Could you talk a little bit about what you perceive to be the challenges that we face with threat modeling in the current contexts that we have today?
Absolutely, that's a great question. Currently, there is an still increase in interest around threat modeling. But what I am seeing is that we needed to focus on providing value to the business with the threat modeling. Not all the practices are able to provide that value. When you focus too much on compliance, then the threat modeling experience becomes sterile. It doesn't provide a tangible value. It doesn't identify problems, and its impact is very limited compared with other approaches. Instead, if you do that, focusing on making an impact on the development activity, on the project where you work on, and facilitating making decisions, allowing to implement the actual mitigations to make the solution better and more secure, then the value becomes immediately visible and you can really provide something that makes a difference.
That's really interesting. You talked about a lot of things there. So, we talk about value, we talk about focusing on mitigations, identifying potential threats and what may be attack vectors. A lot of developers work in the space where they have to implement the code. They have to essentially put things out in terms of the build itself. And then we have our infrastructure teams and our ops teams that work in tandem within the DevOps context to try to deploy these things out. Could you talk a little bit about how threat modeling might be able to help our DevOps teams?
That's another great question. Actually, this is, from my point of view, a new frontier. In particular, when we consider open source tools, this is something that historically has been a very bad experience. I mean, what is most important of threat modeling is the ability to link the activities that need to be done to the reasons why you need to do them. But at the end of the day, if you identify the fact that you need to implement a specific control to address some risk, you need then to ensure that that control enters in your development flow. So nowadays, when we talk about DevOps, this means the backlog. And if you don't have a process facilitating inserting in the backlog the various activities that need to be done, and even before that, to have a meaningful conversation with the product owner to decide what needs to be done and when, then the threat modeling activity becomes something not useful, something that will produce only some piece of paper put in some drawer. So that's it, making actionable, making the threat model something that joins, that becomes part of the existing flow. That's a very important need for nowadays, for today.
Yeah, that's interesting. You talk about integrating within the flow, and many times we hear about how DevOps moves extremely fast. We've got automated pipelines, we've got integrated tools, we've got automated tests, and here we've got threat modeling, which historically has been done through analysis that requires a human to go in there and take a look at a system. From your perspective, what are you seeing in terms of trying to overcome this challenge and shortening the time that it takes to conduct threat modeling so that it can integrate into the speed that is required by DevOps teams?
Well, first, we needed to ensure that threat modeling is made part of the natural flow of a DevOps project. So if we are adopting Scrum, of course, that's not the only option, but the idea is to have threat modeling done regularly during the various sprints. Could be done at each sprint, focusing on some aspects. We in Microsoft do threat modeling even at the so-called sprint 0, which is the sprint where you start identifying the first activities to be put in the backlog. And this is a great moment because you may start to getting the information about what is your system and how you can, the first elements about how you can improve its security. So making that part of this flow is essential. Automation is also important, plays an important role, but we need to ensure that automation is not going to take all the focus. I mean, way to perform automation is to generate automatically threats and even mitigations after you have designed in some way your diagram, your system. You identify the characteristic, perhaps the technologies, and then you have the tool automatically identifying the problems and then the mitigations. But this is not a perfect approach, and this is an euphemism, of course, because every tool tends to have a very narrow sight about your system. The approach is not holistic. You are using a specific service, then that service is known to have potential problems, and then there are some potential mitigations that are in place. If you focus your threat model on using this approach and you do not you use your mind to instead get better analysis, then essentially you are getting less valuable results, or perhaps the same results that you will get using best practices, but spending much more. So the investment essentially will be a bad investment. So the point here is to use those accelerators, use automation, but in a smart way, without compromising your ability to think. And also, I will say that another very important aspect is to use to integrate the experience with some accelerators. There are some repeated activities in the process that happen, and if we can identify those repetitions and automate them. I'm not talking about generating threats and mitigation in this case. It's more about using mechanisms that would allow to, for example, assign a status to some mitigation that is applied in multiple places, and you do that once instead of every time you have that mitigation. That makes things much faster, and in my experience, it really helps to cut the time to perform threat models.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Just a reminder to our listeners that you're listening to the Balancing Act podcast from Security Compass, where we talk to experts and thought leaders as we all try to make this world a place where we can trust our technology to be secure and to be safe. Simone, you've brought up a lot of really interesting ideas in terms of where threat modeling is evolving into. If we look at organizations today, and they really would like an on-ramp to start to put into practice some of the things that you had mentioned and some of the trends that you're seeing. Where would you suggest that organizations begin to start? Is it something that maybe developers can play a role in? Is it something security teams can begin to evangelize and start to get moving forward? How do we evolve into this new paradigm?
That's a great question, and I will say that a factor in making such a decision is the current effort, or the ability of the security teams to take this burden. You know, nowadays security teams are very small, typically for the size of the organization, the problems that they needed to tackle. And adding in a new burden may be problematic, in particular in the first months and perhaps the first year of the adoption. So I think that what I'm seeing is that perhaps the most effective way to introduce something so complex like threat modeling is, of course, to start small, to adopt a gradual approach that will start from some proof of concept, some small project, just to start to learn by doing. And also to leverage, whenever it is possible, security champions program. That's a very effective way, because security champions programs allow to provide to members of the development teams, specialized members, I will say, for that I have some interest in security, and the idea is to delegate to them some activities like threat modeling. Of course, the effort, the activity, that the role for the security team should be to lead this initiative, should be to provide guidance, to provide the tools, provide the knowledge bases, and to essentially define how this activity shall be done. And this is a fundamental, that's an extremely important aspect, because this allows to have similar results independently from who is doing the threat model. So, but by using an approach like the security champion, you can also make it reasonable and make it executable even by organizations which have security teams that are having a lot on their plate. Of course, you cannot think that embracing something like threat modeling is going to be free. It is not talking about licenses. There are some good tools even for free, but it's more about the cost that you have to pay for the persons, the people who execute those activities. They need to have some learning for them, to have some ramp up, to guide them, and to essentially make this security champion program effective.
That's great. Thanks, Simone. There may be people in our audience who might want to follow you, might want to understand more about what you're doing. You've got a blog, you've got things that you're doing in the open source community. Can you provide our listeners with some ways that they could just see some of the things you're doing? Maybe talk about where your blog sits and where on GitHub they might be able to find your project?
Absolutely. I would suggest to consider the threatsmanager.com site, where is my tool as a starting point. You will find the links from that site to my blog, and also to a GitHub repo where you can find additional ways to interact, to access the sources and so on. And the site also has provides a couple of ways to interact with me.
Wonderful. That's great. And there you have it, folks. Thank you so much for your time, Simone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's been an amazing conversation. And to our listeners, we encourage you to get in touch, look at the Threats Manager Studio, the tool, the GitHub repo, the blogs. And we encourage you to listen in next time on the Balancing Act podcast from Security Compass.
Want to learn about what Security Compass has to offer? Check out securitycompass.com/demo for a free demo today. Want more of the Balancing Act? Be sure to subscribe to our channel wherever you listen to podcasts for more episodes.